It is an immense pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Bruno Jacobs and Professor Robert Rollinger. Dr. Jacobs is Professor of Ancient Near Eastern Studies for der Asiatische Altertumswissenschaft at the University of Basel and is known for his pertinent work on many aspects of the ancient Iranian world. His work, which focuses on the Achaemenid Empire, but also on the Hellenistic and post-Hellenistic Iranian polities and their relations with the Mediterranean and the ancient Near Eastern cultures, is distinguished by its great capaciousness and his ability to control a varied material culture and equally diverse textual testimonies. His publications obviously reflect his wide research interests, from his first monograph based on his doctoral dissertation in classical archaeology on the Greek and Persian elements in Lycian funerary art during the Achaemenid dominion, the so-called griechische und persische Elemente in der Grabkunst Lykiens zur Zeit der Achaemeniden Herrschaft, which already showcases his ability to navigate between the classical and Iranian traditions and synthesize their insights to evince the symbiotic nature of Lycian art, to his important volume on the later Achaemenid provincial administration, die Verwaltung im Achaemenidischen Reich zur Zeit Darius III, published in 1994. All of these are testimony to his great versatility. He's one of the handfuls of scholars who have deeply investigated the Irano-Hellenistic kingdom of the Commagene and its important religious idiosyncrasies, which in certain way continues his interest in trans-regional cultural exchanges, whose first manifestation we saw in his investigation of the Lycian funerary art. Of tremendous service has been the publication, in conjunction with Ursula Hakel and Dieter Weber, of a compendium in 3 volumes of all source material pertaining to the Parthian Empire in 2010. So very few people are as well positioned as Professor Jacobs for undertaking the editorship of the companion volume on the Achaemenid Empire. As to Dr. Rollinger, one of our close affiliates at the center, allow me to say a few words, since he's already quite a celebrity in our midst. Dr. Rollinger is Professor of Ancient History and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the University of Innsbruck and a driving force behind the Melamour Symposia. He belongs to a rare breed of historians of antiquity for whom the world of antiquity constitutes a connected expanse. For him, the Mediterranean and ancient Near Eastern world are so profoundly intertwined that we have to move beyond more rudimentary notions of exchanges and connections and strive to understand this geography as an indivisible cultural expanse that calls for a more holistic treatment. It is fair to say that the Achaemenid Empire occupies an immensely important place in his academic endeavors, as very few have contributed as much as he has to its visibility in the academic discourse. His work is too multifaceted for me to attempt an introduction at this juncture. Suffice it to say, his writing, beginning with his now classical monograph on Herodotus' narrative on Babylonia, namely Herodotus' Babylonische Logos, is a must for all students of ancient history and exquisitely illustrates not only his ability to command over literary traditions, critically to assess them or innovative to synthesize them, but more importantly, show his grand and wide perspective on what constitutes ancient history and historiography in the tradition we just described. Numerous are his monographs and articles on the ancient Near East and on modi of historical thinking, ideology, and propaganda, and ancient Persia. As impressive as his writings are, his editorial work is even more breathtaking by dint of the quality and prevalence. I think I've counted last year up to 65 volumes. It might be by now 75. Some 70 or 75 volumes by my last account have been edited. So they have reestablished the holistic study of the ancient world as a discipline. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jacobs and Rollinger. So what is the rationale behind the companion volume? It's following the landmark that the Achaemenid History Workshop represented, followed by Pierre Briand's magisterial work on the Achaemenids, so-called Histoire de l'Empire Perse, and the many workshops and proceedings organized by the chaire d'Histoire et Civilisation du Monde Achéménide, namely Pierre Briand, at the Collège de France, which is the Persica series, and published in the Persica series, not to speak of the series Oriens et Occidens, can I see that slide as well, by Reichert, as well as Classica et Orientalia by Harasowitz, which cover much Achaemenid studies ground. Why do you think there was a need for a companion volume? And what does this add to the sum of knowledge we already possess? So what were the stimuli, maybe, to begin with? And then I would speak about the consequences with Dr. Rollinger. If I can maybe ask that question to you, Professor Jacobs. Thank you so much.
When the request was made to us by Wiley Blackwell to conceive and publish a companion to the Achaemenid Persian Empire, Robert and I had just completed a major joint project, namely the publication of a colloquium volume entitled The Achaemenidhof, the Achaemenid Court, and therefore, because this had worked very well, we thought we should do it. In the course of the time it took for the companion to appear, it became apparent that the process of editing was by far the more arduous task, but the conception was a challenge that arose first, and the concept, after all, had to be what, in terms of the question posed, had to justify undertaking the project at all. Something had to be launched that, in view of the existence of older works, such as the third volume of the Cambridge History of Iran, the weighty work of Pierre Briand, L'Histoire de l'Empire Perse Alexandre, would bring something new to the reader, and that would also be able to stand up in the face of possibly competing projects. One thing was immediately clear to us: the companion should not be a pure history of events. Of course, an event history could not be missing in a handbook, but it should, in addition to political history, also illuminate cultural history, economic history, religious history, and Geistesgeschichte. And all this should be embedded in a concept that is new in many respects. The innovative elements can be summarized in 5 points, I think. And I will, if you allow, start with the first one. I call it embedding in the older history of the Near East. In the 2 decades before the beginning of our project, a clear reorientation had taken place concerning the origin of the Achaemenid Empire and its political and cultural predecessors. As early as 1988, an article by Helene Sanchisi-Werdenburg had appeared, a contribution to the third Achaemenid History workshop entitled, "Was There Ever a Median Empire?" In it, she fundamentally questioned the existence of a Median Empire and understood the Median territory as the action space of an alliance rather than the territory of a clearly defined state entity. The fruit of the doubts sown by Helene Sanchisi then emerged in a quite excellent 2003 publication of a colloquium edited by Giovanni Battista Lanfranchi, Michael Rove, and Robert Rollinger, entitled "Continuity of Empire, Assyria, Media, Persia." Greatly simplifying the result of this publication, it can be said that the Median Empire, as it is portrayed, especially in Herodotus, namely as the prototype of the Achaemenid Empire, is a fiction. The political and cultural legacy of the Median Empire to that of the Achaemenids, which had been assumed so far, became questionable all at once. For some time now, Elam has taken the place long held by media in the traditional historical picture. Elam, whose importance is perhaps most succinctly demonstrated by the fact that Elamite remained the administrative language in large parts of the Achaemenid Empire for a considerable time, was a predecessor of hardly overestimable importance, not only geographically, but also politically and culturally. This shift in emphasis, which had been initiated by comparably recent research and the fundamental importance of the ancient Near Eastern heritage for the emerging Achaemenid Empire, seemed to us reason enough to plan a separate section, Section 4, Predecessors of the Persian Empire and its Rise, in which the predecessor empires, including Assyria, Babylonia, and Urartu, would be treated. This is the first point, and I have described it now. I don't know if Robert wants to say something to that.
I may maybe just add or elaborate a little bit on what you have explained to us so splendidly, Bruno. I think, as all of you know, dealing with the history of the Achaemenid Persian Empire always suffered from some deficiencies, especially by the fact that the focus and the view on the empire was so much divided by different disciplines. Every discipline looking, let's say, at a specific aspect of the empire, but not really discussing with each other. So let's say scholars of the ancient Near Eastern history just took the Achaemenid Persian Empire as let's say a state where the late phase of ancient Near Eastern history took place. Scholars from ancient history, from classics, were viewing on the Achaemenid Empire from the classical sources, mainly looking at it from the Western fringes, and many times just sharing the ideologies that were placed by the classical sources. And scholars who have a more or let's say who are closer to what we call the field of Iranian studies had their specific views on the empire, especially by language and a different conception. And it is very interesting, and it was very interesting to observe that there is generally not a real discussion between these different approaches. And then another aspect comes into play, and which Bruno already highlighted, that you cannot only view on the empire by written sources, so that more and more archaeological sources are looming large. And this is not only true, let's say, for the western parts of the empire, some very well documented like Anatolia, Syria, or even Babylonia, but especially for the eastern ones. And it was absolutely clear for us that if we want to take a fresh look on this fascinating empire as a whole, so we have to unite these perspectives into one, and also leave an open space for discussions among the scholars who are participating to this project. So we were not interested in, let's say, creating a single-minded, monotonous view on the empire, but also somehow mirroring the different approaches on the empire, but in its entire transdisciplinarity. So I think this was a very, very important aspect for us.
If I may continue, Robert has pointed already to the second innovative element. I call it the inclusion of material culture as a historical source. This was our second innovative approach, which arose almost naturally from the fact that Robert, as a historian, and I myself, as an archaeologist, collaborated. In addition to the written testimonies generally accepted as sources, we decided to give material culture as a whole the space it deserved as a historical source. To this end, on the one hand, we established a section written sources with 9 chapters devoted essentially to the individual languages in which the sources are written. It is Old Persian, Elamite, Babylonian, Aramaic, and of course, Greek and Latin. On the other hand, we have conceived 10 chapters, archaeological sources, which we have divided geographically, if only because of the stationary character of many testimonies. Now, the distribution of archaeological monuments within the former territory of the Achaemenid Empire is very unequal, and this certainly also, but not only, due to the varying intensity of research. Thus, in the West, where, for example, Babylonia and Assyria, Cyprus, Asia Minor, and the Caucasus region received their own chapters, the chapter division is more detailed than in the east half of the empire, where the northeast and the southeast each received their own chapter. This, however, is due to the current status quo of the existing material. The third, this is a bigger chapter. I call it the attempt to compensate for the West-East imbalance, also West-Ost-Gefälle in the sources. It was important to us to treat the entire imperial territory as balanced as possible. While there are natural limits to this endeavor, since a West-East divide in the emergence of both written and pictorial sources is undeniable, our goal was to make people aware, on the one hand, that the silence that reigns for decades over many eastern regions of the Achaemenid Empire is due to the source situation and not to historical eventlessness. And on the other hand, to intervene here in a compensatory manner whenever possible. The framework of conventional event history is based inevitably quite substantially on the classical written sources because they describe, contextualize, and interpret events. These sources, for their part, are naturally strongly fixated on those areas with which the Greeks interacted. That is, those that lay within sight, so to speak. Asia Minor, the Levant, the Black Sea area, and Egypt. A glance at a map, however, makes it easy to see that this covers only a fraction of the empire's territory, as Robert just said, the western fringes, in principle. Crises and uprisings in Asia Minor, Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Egypt are known to us, but we may well assume that other parts of the imperial territory also saw comparable political conflicts. But news about crises in the vast eastern territories of the empire have come to us only in a few exceptional cases. Therefore, Robert and I designed a section 4C, a subsection, under Persian rule with 19 chapters dealing with territories from all parts of the empire individually. This did not eliminate the mentioned West-East discrepancy in source material, but it gave us the opportunity to tell a regional history of the Achaemenid period for the most different parts of the empire, at least where an even very patchy source situation allowed for it. Thus, in addition to the core areas of Parsa and Uja, Media, and Babylonia, the eastern parts of the imperial territory are also covered by separate chapters, and especially the peripheral areas in the north, east, and south. For the north stand the Sakha areas east of the Caspian Sea, for the east, India, and for the south, the Gulf region, the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, Nubia, and Cyrenaica. The selection of the regions was, of course, determined by whether the existence of written sources or archaeological evidence provided any basis at all for an individual treatment. These minimum conditions are now also given in those regions which the Persians ruled only temporarily, at most for a very short time, or only in parts. It is Macedonia, Thrace, the northern Black Sea region, and the Caucasus region, or the Greek Mediterranean world.
Yeah, I was wondering, we have spoken about 3 points up to now, and the latter two being the importance of the archaeological sources as a means to complement the focus on documentary sources or written sources, and obviously the very, very important remark about the East-West divide, which means that obviously we just have, by the wheels of fortune, more sources available to us from the western part of the empire. But this is not tantamount to the fact that the East is eventless, without any events, or as eventless, so to say. So these are very important points. I was wondering whether you could maybe say something to that as well.
I would like to highlight that what was Bruno hinting at, that the fact of the plurality and the diversity of the sources is a very important aspect, and we thought that we have to create a consciousness about the difficult source situation by placing every source in its specific context. So it was our intention to to make possible a view on the empire from very different angles without claiming that this is the one and only view you can have on the empire. For example, if you read the chapters in section 4, the more traditional ones dealing with the history of the empire, you will see that one aspect which is traditionally very much looming high in any handbook on the history of the Achaemenid Persian Empire does not play really that much a role, that is the Persian Wars. Of course, they are there, you know, they are dealt with, I would say, in a very competent way, but it's only one part of a much larger picture on the empire. So, you know, there was always a huge discussion since the Achaemenid history workshops about how to use the classical sources. Of course, it was the classical sources that dominated for a very long time the view on the Achaemenid Persian Empire, but with the understanding of the how much these sources have been ideologically biased, there was a new approach coming into existence. But of course, this new approach shouldn't move into its extreme by totally ignoring these sources. These sources are nevertheless important, but one has to highlight their specific context. And one has to make clear, and I think this is an important task which we were following with this companion, that there are many other sources that have to be taken into perspective. These are, on the one hand, Bruno already explained it, the sources of the so-called material culture, but there are also plenty of other written sources. There are sources of a documentary character originating from different parts of the empire, written in different languages. The most prominent ones, of course, are originating from Babylonia and from Egypt, but even beyond these core areas, we have, for example, the Aramaic Ostraka from Idumea and the important new text findings from Baghdad. So all is there in the companion, all is there dealt with as a historical source, putting these sources into their relevant contexts and showing the great plurality of this empire. Of course, at the very same time, this is a huge challenge for any scholar, or let's say for scholarship as a whole, because it makes clear that the clue into approaching this fascinating empire is just transdisciplinary cooperation. And that's what we tried, you know, to create, let's say, a handbook, or you can even say a platform that makes such a view possible without neglecting any perspective, but by putting it into its very right places.
Thank you so much. Before I would ask maybe Professor Jacobs to continue with the fourth and fifth point, allow me just to provide a very short recap of what has been stated. I think the initial question was, why was at that specific juncture in time, and obviously this question would never be asked with respect to Roman history or Byzantine history, why do we need the 164th companion volume in Roman Empire or the 512th in the history of the Hellenic world? But obviously the question for the Achaemenid Empire, since we have had so many publications recently, was such, namely why at this juncture a new companion, or actually a companion, since so much has been published in the last 4 decades, so many strides have been done, and what does it intend to do? Some of the points that have been so systematically introduced by Professor Jacobs is that under the last of which we shall be hearing in a moment, the first three are to maintain a sense of unity, obviously, about the empire, but at the same time allow these tensions in the opinion still to reflect within the framework of point of views and perceptions of things. For example, we would come to speak on that in a moment. When you look at the section on the religion, you would see that there is a comprehensive section on religion or religions of the empire, but there is also a very diverse landscape of opinions being there presented, so that the author, the reader would have the opportunity to actually form his own opinion or her own opinion based upon the evidence that has been introduced, or that basically would be subject to a diversity of possibilities. The second important point was that obviously specifically in the philological traditions, which is one of the main contingents of people dealing with the Achaemenid Empire, the Achaemenid written sources are exceedingly important, and among them even the Greek and Latin sources are given higher value because very few people go through the training of knowing the sources of the empire, and it's very extraordinarily expensive in matters of time to even get to be acquainted with the sources. So the archaeological sources have been foregrounded in a way more than ever before, and so we have a better understanding of exactly what this empire is based on as the sources are concerned. And then the third important point was the so-called West-East divide. That obviously the concentration of the sources on one side does not mean that the empire has been less active on the other. So, and the main example is that the empire has not spent its entire time just going to war with the Greeks. There have been other things it has been busy with, and that must have been maybe a smaller matter in its entire encounters altogether. So these are some of the points that have been explicitly foregrounded by Professor Jacobs, and I would like maybe to continue with the fourth and fifth point.
If you allow, I would like to say a little bit more on the third point, because perhaps to explain it still a little bit more what we intended. In these 19 chapters, you reach certain limits because of the source situation. In the following section 5, structures and communication, this section further highlights the complexity of the circumstances. The title Structures and Communication takes into account the fact that the exercise of power is not possible without top-down communication. Therefore, one chapter is devoted to the topic languages and communication. Particular attention as a medium of communication is naturally drawn in research, especially when written sources are scarce, to those monumental genres that function as image carriers. I don't know if this is a good word, image carrier, Bildträger. Yeah? Therefore, we have provided 3 chapters dealing with the most important genres of these Bildträger: large-scale pictorial art, seals and sealing, and numismatics. In the respective chapters, there should also be looked at whether those genres of monuments could really fulfill the communicative function ascribed to them. This is certainly not the case for large-scale pictorial art because of its limited distribution. The situation is similar with coins. They were minted in the Achaemenid period only in places where monetary economy was practiced, and this was the case also only in a small part of the Achaemenid imperial provinces. Seals, on the other hand, were much more widespread, and here future excavations are likely to eliminate many hitherto white spots. With this mention of seals and sealing, the certifying medium of the administration par excellence, I already referred to the factor which was, in my opinion, a carrier of the above demanded communication necessary for the exercise of rule, the administration, and the veins of the communication flow were the traffic routes, in particular the royal roads, but of course also waterways. We will have to speak about the administration later, therefore here a few words about the traffic routes. Here, thanks to the campaign reports of the Alexander historiographers, thanks to the information provided by the Persepolis Fortification Archive and by some other sources, our level of information is favorable, so favorable that we obtain a fairly balanced picture of the entire empire, at least as far as the main arteries of the communication are concerned. These were demonstrably advanced to the outermost provinces of the Achaemenid Empire, An example that I always like to use in this context shows how intertwined the development of traffic and the flow of communication and information work. Arriving at the Hyphasis, today's Sutlej, the easternmost of the rivers of the Punjab, the Macedonian army refuses to obey Alexander and his request to move further east. The soldiers' refusal, however, only concerns a further march eastward. When Alexander gives in and continues southward, the army follows him. Therefore, in my opinion, the reason for the refusal can only have been that the goal with which one had set out, namely to conquer the Persian Empire, was fulfilled at the Hyphasis, at least as far as its extension to the east was concerned. The soldiers did not like to follow the plan to settle this goal with another, more distant one, as Alexander intended. The Hyphasis thus marked the eastern border of the empire. Beyond that, however, it also marked the edge of the known world. Up to there, one had come based on information that was locally available. Wouter Henkelmann and I have formulated the situation at the Hyphasis in our joint chapter Roads and Communication as follows. The space beyond it was uncharted, and the object of fantastic reports. Tales about mighty kings, enormous armies, giant rivers, endless deserts, and invincible war elephants abandoned. To ward off such dangers, altars and oversized clenae were erected by the Macedonians, monuments marking the end of a connected, integrated world and holding back the mighty adversaries living in the disparate and terrible chaos of the unknown. A similarly balanced picture, and thus a further confirmation of the attempt we have made to bring the eastern territories of the empire into the center of interest, is offered by the provincial administration, which, together with the economy, is the subject of section 6 of the Companion. The most important sources on imperial administration come from the various archives and archival remains found at Persepolis and Susa, from Babylonia, and others Robert has already numbered shortly before. A separate chapter is devoted to each of these regions, also to Persis, to Babylonia, to Asia Minor, to Egypt, and to Bactria. The Ahura Mazda correspondence, whose origin in Bactria is generally accepted and which was presented in 2012 in an editio major by the recently deceased Shaul Shakit and Joseph Navi, is an excellent example of how a single find can change our perspective. Indeed, it now forms a weighty counterpart to the Ashama correspondence, which appeared in 2020 in a 3-volume publication procured by Christopher Taplin and John Marr, but which had not only been known for some time before, but had been available on the internet since 2013 in a preliminary publication by the aforementioned colleagues. In both correspondences, persons are involved who may be addressed with large certainty as satraps. One dates from the second half of the 5th century BC and the extreme southwest of the empire, the other from the last third of the 4th century BC and the far northeast of the empire. Both show so much formal and linguistic agreement that one must presuppose a well-organized system of chancelleries, as Margarete Vollmer has put it, and recognize, as Wouter Henkelmann writes, the impact of scribal schools. The tight organization that becomes apparent meant that within that network of networks in which the entire empire was encompassed, there was a compatibility of administrative procedures that allowed, for example, a traveler from Bactria to travel to the center of the empire with a voucher that ensured that he would be provided with food in all the provinces he passed on his way. The most important source is undoubtedly the Persepolis fortification archive, and this, unlike the overwhelming majority of existing written sources, favors the east of the empire. According to a conjecture by Walter Henkelmann, this is because Persepolis was probably the first port of call for travelers from the east of the empire, a function that Susa or perhaps Babylon may have had for travelers from the west. In combination with other sources, this gives a fairly balanced picture for the entire empire.
Dr. Hollinger, would you like to maybe address a few of the remarks on this as well?
Yes, I think the most important point, which becomes evident by what Bruno has just been summarizing, is the fact that the empire is not anymore seen from a specific perspective from outside or from a specific province from inside, but there has been developed a completely new perspective on the empire, taking truly into conspectus the different regions of the empire and taking into consideration the efforts, the admirable efforts the imperial administration has been taking to keeping this gigantic space together, reaching from modern Pakistan to the Aegean. So it is not only this question of communication networks on the one side, but also the efforts taken by the administration, by the central administration as such, and moving into, let's say, each single corner of the empire, which creates a totally new perspective on this imperial machinery and into the empire as an entity per se. So the empire is not anymore a neighbor seen from a specific point of view, from the west, from the south, but it is an entity as such. And I think this may and hopefully opens up a path for any future research that can be done or should be done under the heading of Achaemenid studies as such.
So I come to the fourth innovative point. I call it structuring of political history. It concerns the outline of section 4 history, a point that was very important to Robert. As far as the events at the time of the great imperial crisis around the reign of Gaumata are concerned, there are, as is well known, many different opinions in scholarship. Now, most, and so Robert and I, agree today that Darius I usurped the throne and had a legitimacy problem. We differ as to the relationship between the ruling lines from which Cyrus the Great and Darius I came. While Robert is of the opinion that Cyrus and Darius were descendants of two different dynasties, I am of the opinion that they were descendants of two different branches of one and the same dynasty. The difference is significant from several aspects, especially with regard to continuity and discontinuity in the political agenda, in the choice of the capital, in the use of architectural forms, and the pictorial decoration of buildings in pictorial themes, and the use of written media, etc. The question on the relationship between the two rulers is of some importance. For example, are the linkages at Pasargadae, the decoration of Palace P with reliefs, and the placement of Darius of inscriptions in the name of Cyrus, tributes to his illustrious predecessor, and at the same time indications of the dynastic linkage, or are they, in a sense, fabricated evidence of a relationship that did not exist? In other words, are linkages a self-evident expression of continuity, or are they attempts to fake that continuity? Conversely, are breaks such as the move from Pasargadae to Persepolis consequences of a dynastic change, or can they be explained within the framework of fundamental dynastic continuity? The answer to these questions is now strongly complicated by the source situation. It is infinitely richer for the time of Darius than for the time of his predecessors. I mention only the royal inscriptions, which begin under Darius and directly at the beginning with the longest and most important of these texts, the Bisutun inscription. Furthermore, the enormous relief friezes in Persepolis, and here certainly chance plays a not insignificant role, the Persepolis fortification archive. However, one wants to evaluate the caesura between Cyrus and Darius. It exists. And this caesura is expressed in the structure of section 4, after a suggestion of Robert, in the way that the history of the Persian Empire up to the reign of Cambyses is put into a context with the predecessor empires, predecessors of the Persian Empire and its rise is the heading, and therein especially chapter 27, from Assurbanipal to Cambyses, written by Robert himself. This is contrasted with the second part entitled From Gaumata to Alexander, in which, in the light of a completely changed source situation, the aforementioned imperial crisis and the further history up to Alexander's campaign are dealt with one after the other.
Thank you so much. I just, I didn't, thank you for explaining this. I didn't remark that before. I just read it and I didn't really understand it maybe as well as you have mentioned. So Gaumata for you would fall into the second line, or just, you know, you give it a historical reality, or it will be just a placeholder for Badia in that sense?
Yeah, I think he fell in the second part, not because we are sure that he is the brother of Cambyses, or he is not the brother of Cambyses, but because he appears on the scene at the Bisutun monument, which is of Darius, and therefore it had to be part of the second part. Wonderful.
Thank you so much. So we have one more point I think we have to cover, and I think we are. I would also like to have maybe some time for a number of other questions that.
If you, I take the fifth point. It is a short one. It is embedding in a history of reception and research, symmetrically to the treatment of the predecessor empires of the Achaemenid Empire. We have planned two sections on the reception and history of research. One subsection deals with the reception in Europe under different aspects, for example, in different sources and source groups, from Greek historians to modern Europe, but also as a fashion. Another subsection treats the local reception in Iran, also up to modern times. A third subsection deals with two areas of reception that have been rarely addressed so far, namely popular culture and counterfeiting. The extensive section on the history of research is divided according to different research traditions, a division that was also made because of the scope of this topic. Thus, individual chapters are devoted to Western and Eastern Europe, to the United States, and to the country whose heritage is the subject of the companion, Iran.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jacobs, for this extraordinary, rich expose of the 5 categories of innovations that, you know, if I just may briefly remind them to audiences, are allowing for diversity of opinions to express itself, foregrounding the archaeological sources, allowing a better comprehension, reifying the West-East divide, and allowing for a better inclusion of the East into the reconstruction of the historical frame of the Achaemenid Empire. The important notion of how to basically conceive of the of Cyrus's line and Darius's line, whether we have indeed 2 different dynasties, the Thespiid and the Achaemenid, and what the ramification thereof might be, or we have indeed to do with 2 branches of the Seleucid family, and ultimately the extraordinary importance of the reception, not only not only in antiquity, but also in modern times, and also the inclusion of such things as popular culture and counterfeiting. That was actually quite extraordinarily interesting. The counterfeits as a phenomenon of reception as well. If I may, thank you so much, Dr. Jacobs. If I may now, we come back to you with other questions. If I may turn my attention to Dr. Rollinger. Professor Rollinger, if there is, I would very much like to have your opinion on the fourth position, namely the Achaemenid and Achaemenid dynasties, and how you perceive of that. But also after that, I would like to ask you a more specific question that relates to your work. How has your work that has been determined maybe in the last decade or two greatly by your preoccupation with empires of the past, and also basically so empire studies in a way, how has this study of yours on different comparanda, different empires, allow you to reframe, comprehend, innovate in a certain way the position of the Achaemenid Empire as a world empire? And how does it allow you to perceive of it now in contrast to everything that has preceded it and everything that has come thereafter, maybe as an inspiration thereof? So there are two questions I have. The Thespian and Achaemenid issue that I think would be extraordinarily important for our audiences. And how would you situate the Achaemenid Empire? Thank you.
Let's start with the Thespian and Achaemenid issue. I think just a short note. I would say that my opinion is not so much different from Bruno's, actually. It's much more maybe a discussion on terminology, because what is absolutely clear and what is of utmost importance is that there is a caesura after the reign of Cambyses, which is visible on all levels. And you can also see by studying the BC2 inscription of Darius that he is also presenting himself somehow in a new way. If we say, how is the family of Darius related to the one of Cyrus and Cambyses, we have to say we do not know. So I do not have any doubts that they were relatives, like any European family in the Middle Ages were relatives, But if we talk from a historical point of view of a dynasty is a social construct in every part of history. It's a social construct. It's not a fact, So if you, and this social construct is important. Just look at the so-called dynasty of ancient Egyptian history, or look, for example, at the relationship in the French Middle Ages between the Carpathians on the one side and the Valois. They are from the same branch, but it's a new dynasty because they want to show that something new happened. So it's a social construct. It's not a question of DNA. It's a social construct. And I think from that point of view, they are clearly different. And that legitimizes on all aspects. And it's also an important point of historical analysis to make clear that this is different. And it's not only different from our outside perspective, but it's also different from the inside perspective. And I think everybody has to agree on that. And if you agree on that, it's not any more important of saying, well, could they be of the same family, or might there be different family branches? So this is of secondary importance, So that's the point. Taking it as a social construct and to highlight the differences between the history of Cambyses, Cyrus, and even for Cambyses, for Cyrus and Cambyses, you see much more continuities with the epoch before, with the Neo-Babylonian times, and with Darius, you really have the establishment of something new on all levels, starting also with the names of the kings, but also of any kind. So I think it has a high analytical value to talk about two different dynasties. I think this is for me, this is an analytical stance, and not so much, dealing with the question of how have they been really related. So this we will probably never know. So that's my answer to the first question, Raim. The second one was yes, on the imperial term. Yes. I have to say that my interest in imperial studies was highly triggered from very early onwards by dealing with ancient Eastern empires and also dealing with the Achaemenid Persian Empire. So this somehow stimulated my thoughts and my interest into imperial studies on a comparative level. And you are absolutely right that there was very much engaged in this kind of studies in the last years, also taking a much broader view on the subject, a much broader comparative view. And I think that the Achaemenid Persian Empire is on many, many levels a paradigmatic empire, which shows on a paradigmatic level characteristics which all empires in world history share or have in common, and also gives this empire a very special place within comparative imperial studies. Just to mention some examples. So one example is that actually empires do not have real borders or borderlines as modern national states used to have. So there are much more border zones, dynamic border zones, flexible border zones that are looming large, and border zones which to a high degree mark the transfer from an area which is under direct control of the empire to an area which is not so much under direct control, but where the imperial claim to control this area is still there. I think this is the last aspect is a very important one, that modern scholarship has to distinguish between imperial claim on the one hand and the reality of rule on the other side. Just take the famous example of the list of the lands or the list of the peoples, where modern scholarship has for a long time had the tendency to take this, let's say, only from the viewpoint, so that this encompasses an area which is under direct control of the great king, and not so much looking on the claim or on the great king pretending to rule. So this pretending to rule is another important aspect, for empires have the tendency to claim to rule the world. So they rule actually everything. What they have, what they are commanding is the world. And I think the Achaemenid Persian Empire is a perfect example for this, because if you look on information that we have, let's say from the inscription of the great kings on areas not ruled by the great king, actually you have none, So generally, scholarship has taken this effect in a very single-minded way, I would say. For example, when modern scholarship was for a very long time just focusing on the Persian War as the one and important event. So it was thinking, it is absolutely clear that the great kings didn't report on the Persian Wars because they lost these wars, and for that fact they didn't report on it. But we even do not have a royal report on the conquest of Egypt, although the great king was quite successful in this manner. So there is a very specific stance in dealing with these cases, and you can only approach them accordingly if you develop a larger picture. And I think that the imperial studies or the imperial turn and the comparative approach is a very helpful tool in doing this. Of course, you could mention, or I could mention, plenty of other stuff, like the fact that it's a multi-ethnic, multilingual empire, that the great king also has an important position, not only between the people ruled by the empire and the gods, but also that the king has, to a certain amount, also kind of responsibility for his people and the lands reigned by him. So I think there are plenty of possibilities to compare and to make use of the imperial turn in the one way or in the other. So taking the Achaemenid Persian Empire as a perfect example of an empire, but also by taking into consideration later empire and to compare what we have Achaemenid Persian Empire.
So maybe following upon that, just one more question. How would you perceive the imperial structure of the Achaemenid polity? Obviously, with this, I mean not the period from Cyrus to Bardia, which you rightly place in the continuation of antecedents, but the reinvention of the empire, maybe Darius the First. How is that different from anything we know from the past? How is that going? To what extent is that indeed? Can we speak of a certain Persian innovation in imperial matters? What do you think characterizes? And you spoke about that just briefly, but would you please verify this further?
Yes, I think, Raim, this is a very important point because, like always in history, there are continuities, but there are also discontinuities. So there is both at the very same time, and of course, it depends on the perspective of the historian, which he's just highlighting or balancing with this aspect. Of course, one very important innovative aspect is this absolutely gigantic space. So, of course, also the Neo-Assyrian Empire ruled a large territory, and also the Neo-Babylonian one. But it's absolutely not comparable what we have with the Achaemenid Persian Empire, with this huge expansion into the east and into the west, and this gigantic landmass. And then something comes into play, which Bruno already mentioned in his statement. I think generally empires are projects of elites. So elites play an important role in any empire, but you have, so to say, if you have a special focus on this phenomenon, you have two sorts of elites, and both play a major role. You have an element of elites, which I would call imperial elites. These are those elements of the noblesse, so to say, that have a close relationship to the court and to the king, and it is a kind of ruling people who own also land all over the empire. So by their ownership and by their interest and by their perspective, they, so to say, encompass the empire as a whole, and their personal interests are also to a major degree shared by the destiny of the empire. But then on the same level of importance, you have regional elites, and the communication between these more imperial elites and the regional elites is of utmost importance, because it is the regional elites who are, so to say, the communicative nodes that take, let's say, the imperial spirit from the centers in the plural to the regions. And on this level, of course, you have to follow up certain communicative routes, and you have to manage these gigantic efforts, or these gigantic challenges in commanding such a huge space. And what the Achaemenid did in a really admiring way, and this was already touched upon by Bruno, is to develop an imperial chancellery with an imperial language of communication, an imperial language of administration that was absolutely the same from Egypt, from Elephantine in the south of Egypt to Bactria in the east. So we can see, by comparing the Aramaic texts, they use the same phrases, they use the same termini technici. So these people have been educated in the very same way and in the very same spirit by an imperial agenda that not only created this stuff, but that only brought it into all different angles of the empire. But this is just the roof. And this is this gigantic roof that was created completely new. But then you have a level beneath, you have these still existing local languages and local communication routes, where local languages played a major role. Babylonian, of course, in Babylon, Old Egyptian in Egypt, and all different kinds of languages all over the empire. And there comes another aspect, and I think this cannot be highlighted enough, that the Persian Empire did not nivellate these differences, but the Persians, or the empire, was absolutely proud of presenting this empire as a state of pluralities, as a state of people speaking different languages and of people of different cultural backgrounds. And this was not taken as a deficit, but as something of being proud of as something of representing the world. Just take the fact, which is generally ignored, but I think this is of utmost importance, that whereas the Neo-Assyrian kings, mainly communicated officially in their inscriptions by the Babylonian language, whereas the Achaemenid kings, they chose a different way. So they chose a sample of languages, selected languages, to distribute their will and their imperial agenda into the empire. And this is such an innovative way of pluralities, This is absolutely gigantic. And Bruno also mentioned already the importance of the pictorial evidence we have. The most prominent ones, of course, are the Apadana reliefs, but also the tombs of the kings in Nakshi Rustam, where you see, differentiated by dress and differentiated by the tools using, by the presents brought to the great king, that this is an empire of pluralities. This is also fascinating because it's a very modern thought. And we see it as a real concept for the very first time in this empire. And I think this is not only, let's say, an innovation on the technical aspects of bureaucracy and administration, but also in the ideologies developed to successfully command such a huge space for 200 years, and on a comparative level, this is an absolutely successful empire.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think with that, I'd like to conclude today's presentation. I want to give heartfelt thanks to Professor Robert Rollinger and Professor Bruno Jacobs for their wonderful discussion of this absolutely fantastic 2-volume set. And it does exist, even though the editors don't have their copies yet. I can attest to that. It exists and it's wonderful.
May I, Raheem?
I can sell it to you for money. Yes.
May I add one point? So I want also, in the name of Bruno, I want really to thank Raheem and for giving us the opportunity for presenting this volume, although we do not yet have it, but it does exist within this wonderful framework. And I also want to thank Marissa for coordinating this wonderful event. And I also want to thank all of you for participating and for sharing with us this wonderful experience, of having this volume. And you really have to imagine that we were working, let's say, for 9 years on this volume, really a very, very long time. So for us, it's a very special experience for having it. So thank you again, Raheem, and thank you again, Marissa, for giving us this opportunity.
So yes, also from my side.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Professor Jacobs, Professor Rollinger. Thank you very much for presenting this volume. It does not do justice to what it is. I have had just glances at it, and I'm very impressed. I would be probably reading it for the next decade or so. And again, many thanks to the audience for spending 2 hours of their time with us. But it is certainly a worthwhile cause and certainly worthy of celebration. Thank you so much for everybody. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much for attending, and you can find in the chat links to the Portavid Center website where you can learn more, as well as our upcoming events. And then I've also included a link to our online video library where you can eventually view this lecture once it is filmed and edited, but our previous videos are also posted there. So please have a look at all of those lectures by many of the people in the audience. I see many of your faces. So that's wonderful that we can include you all in our video library. So I hope to see you at one of our upcoming events, and thank you so very much for attending. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.